which they combined into one. As you can see, you see the divider is on the back there. That's the exact same type of box. You see those are really they gave the president everything to counter the entire time. The two boxes combined.
What was he seeing now?
Our American president. No, you're going to have a range of parts. Our American cousin was a comedy farce, sort of like Beverly Hillbillies Goes to London type of thing. We would not find it funny today. You hear the laugh lines are not 21st century laugh lines. And who knew?
Thanks again for coming to Ford's Theater. If I could turn the tables for just a moment, I'm curious, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Nothing too personal. How many of you are visiting Ford's Theater for the first time? Okay, so easily more than half. That's excellent. How many of you by chance have been up in the Washington Monument or on the grounds of the Washington Monument over in the National Mall? Lincoln Memorial? FDR Memorial? Jefferson Memorial? This one's a little more obscure. It's a newer memorial, and it's over by the National Air and Space Museum. The Eisenhower Memorial? Yes, a few hands up. So at some point, as you're walking through Washington, D.C., and you walk by the Washington Monument or these other memorials to our U.S. presidents, the question may run through your mind, why do some presidents get memorials and other presidents don't? Why do we consider some of our presidents to be great, some of them to be average, and some of them to be mediocre or even failures? Well, it's a question we naturally ask. It's in our human nature to ask those questions. But if you pose those same questions to professional historians, what many of them will do is they'll urge caution. They'll often say you need some critical distance, some time to elapse before you can go back and evaluate those presidencies. And so often, 5, 10, 15 years after a president has left office, that's still not enough time to fairly evaluate those presidents and kind of rank them vis-a-vis other presidents. So that's how presidential legacies typically play out. But the legacy of Lincoln is very different than most of our presidents. And so much of that has to do with what transpires in the final week of Lincoln's life. It's going to begin, promisingly enough, on Sunday, April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Court House in central Virginia. That afternoon, in a Union encampment, Confederate General Robert E. Lee is going to come in and he's going to formally surrender to United States Army General Ulysses S. Grant. Once that Confederate surrender takes place, soon thereafter, there's going to be a telegraph message that's sent to Washington, D.C., to the War Department Telegraph Office. Now, the physical location of the building for the War Department Telegraph Office is pretty much just across the street from the White House. And it's a location that President Lincoln would frequent often throughout the Civil War. It allowed him to kind of monitor the ebb and flow of the Civil War. But the news of the surrender is not going to be contained within the walls of that telegraph office. It soon leaks out to Washingtonians. And through word of mouth, within a 24-hour time span, almost everybody in the city knows that the Civil War is over. And that's going to trigger a wave of celebrations throughout the week. Not just one night, but night after night throughout that week. People are going out, they're dining, they're dancing, they're celebrating. And many evenings, there are fireworks that are shot off over the city. Many of the public buildings are illuminated, and people stay out late just walking through the streets of the city. Well, the night after the surrender at Appomattox Court House, it's Monday, April 10th, 1865, and this large throng of well-wishers gathers outside the White House. Sunset, nightfall, they're still there, and some of the people in the crowd are starting to shout up at the windows, asking for President Lincoln to come out and give a speech. And out of the second-story window on the north side of the White House, facing that crowd, steps President Lincoln. He greets the well-wishers, but Lincoln hated to speak off the cuff. He thought he was a terrible extemporaneous speaker, and he knew this from political experience as a young politician. And so he liked to speak from prepared comments. So he thanks the well-wishers for greeting him there. He tells them he doesn't have any special words to share with them. If they come back the following night, he may indeed have a speech for them. So the same thing occurs the following night. It's Tuesday, April 11th, 1865. Once again, Lincoln steps out of the second-story window on the balcony there, and he starts to give a speech. Now, do not be embarrassed if you've never heard of Lincoln's last public speech. It does not have some of the memorable words or the soaring oratorical lines of the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural Address, but nonetheless, it's a very Lincolnian speech. It's a speech that's giving you some deep insights into things that are weighing very heavily on Lincoln's mind. The speech is a speech chiefly about Reconstruction, not celebrating the United States victory over the Confederacy. It's about how you might heal the country and bring those renegade Southern states back into the Union fold. And in doing so, Lincoln is going to devote a lot of time to talking about one Confederate state in particular. Among all the Confederate states, Louisiana has already met the federal requirements to be readmitted back into the country. And Lincoln and many of his cabinet members, they see Louisiana as a standard bearer for how these other southern states might be readmitted back in. And so he'll talk at length about Louisiana. But about halfway through the speech, in a single sentence, Lincoln is going to say something publicly he's never said before. He's going to tell the well-wishers gathered there that evening that he's convinced that certain black males deserve the right to the vote. And when he says this, it's going to be met by polite applause. But there's one spectator standing below that balcony, listening to the president, who is incensed by this. He's livid at President Lincoln. In fact, upon hearing these words, he turns to a fellow co-conspirator, he utters a racial epitaph, and then he says, "Now, by God, I'll put him through." In other words, I'll end his life. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And unfortunately for us, for posterity, that man, John Wilkes Booth, will keep his word. There's a play scheduled at the end of the week here at Ford's Theater. It's a very successful play. It's a 3-act British comedy called Our American Cousin. And it's going to be shown at about 8 p.m. that evening. Well, the morning of the performance, there's a note that's received from the White House. And it's the Lincolns writing to say that they want to attend the performance later on the evening here at Ford's Theater. So the theater staff, they're setting in motion decorating the presidential box here. They're going to find bunches of flags, most of it supplied by the Treasury Department, just down F Street. They have a portrait of George Washington, which they place here to signify the president will be occupying the box. And at about 11 a.m., John Wilkes Booth shows up at the theater. Now, he's not performing in this particular play, but he's performed here many, many times. And he knows every nook and cranny of the theater. He's on very good speaking terms with the owner of the theater, Mr. John T. Ford. And so he can kind of come and go from the theater as he pleases. While he's here, someone will tell him that old man Lincoln is coming to the performance later on that night. Now, Booth keeps a poker face, but that anger towards the president is now boiling over. And now he knows a time and place where the president will be present. And so from that moment on, he becomes a flurry of activity. He goes out, he rents a horse, he contacts fellow co-conspirators, and they're going to try to topple the government in one night by taking out 3 leaders. They're going to try to take out President Lincoln, the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward is attacked at roughly the same time as Abraham Lincoln that night, but he's ultimately going to survive a knife attack. The person assigned to assassinate the vice president never carries through with it. That will not spare his life. He'll be hanged with the other conspirators. And we all know more or less what happens to Abraham Lincoln. Let me get into the details of what occurs. President Lincoln is detained by business at the White House, so he does not show up right when the play begins a few minutes past 8 o'clock. He'll show up at about 8:30. When he does so, in the presidential party, 4 guests alight from the carriage. They come into the lobby here, and then the party of 4 ascends the spiral staircase and comes into the balcony. As that famous 6'4" frame comes into view, there's only one actor here on the stage. That's the famous stage actor, Laura Keene. On cue, she's going to motion down into the orchestra pit in front of the stage, and they're going to strike up a 19th century version of Hail to the Chief. Many recognize this, and they rise up out of their seats. There's cheers and applause as the President and First Lady and their 2 guests come across and take their seats in the box here. Know this, the President sat closest to you, behind the blue field with the white stars. Due to the curvature of the balcony and just the positioning of the seats, of all the 4 occupants of the box, he was the one who was less visible to the crowd. So if you sat on this side over here, you could clearly see a high-backed red rocking chair where the president was. But there was a good chance that most of the audience members would not be able to see the president. The other 3 occupants are in view. Next to the president sat the First Lady, his wife, Mary Lincoln, and then the guest of the Lincolns. That's Clara Harris, the daughter of Ira Harris, a senator from New York, and her fiance, Major Rathbone of the United States Army. They take their seats after arrival, just a few minutes past 8:30. And at about 9:30, John Wilkes Booth rides down Baptist Alley from back in the theater. Gets off his horse, he's holding the reins, he opens the backstage door, and he's looking for somebody to tend to his horse while he comes inside for a bit. He finds somebody to do this, and then he steps in. And behind the stage, backstage, is a door in the floor, a trap door. He opens that door and goes down a passageway underneath the stage while the play is in progress. He then comes up a corresponding trap door on this side, and he comes out up the alleyway between the theater and the establishment next door to it here on 10th Street Northwest. He turns left down the sidewalk and he enters the building next door. That's the Star Saloon. It's one of his favorite watering holes. He goes inside. He orders a whiskey, consumes it, leaves his money on the counter, and then he comes back to the theater. And this time he enters through the formal entrance, the same place that the Lincolns had entered earlier that evening. He comes up the spiral staircase in the same way that the Lincolns had, and he's seen milling about up in the balcony. Eventually, he goes over closer to the door. He encounters Mr. Charles Forbes, the footman for the carriage that night, running interference at the door. We don't know what exactly is said, but we think that all that John Wilkes Booth has to do is something on the order of walk over to Mr. Forbes and say something like, "I'd like to pay my respects to President Lincoln." And that sounds plausible enough. It's difficult for us to conceive of this, but this is an era where people have easy access to our 19th century presidents. He's let right in. Once he's in the narrow hallway just behind the outer door, the door shut behind him, he takes a broken piece of wood, a broken piece of a music stand, and wedges it into the backside of that door, barricading himself inside. About 5 to 6 feet beyond the outer door is an inner door leading directly into the box. And months prior, someone has carved a hole in that door. Booth is able to look through that hole, and he can see the back of President Lincoln engrossed in the third and final act of the play. A big applause line in the play is about to be uttered. Booth steps very quietly into the box. He's lurking behind the president on the president's left side. The applause line is uttered. People clap as they typically do. They laugh, and a gunshot goes off. A single gunshot is fired, pretty much point blank range behind the president's left ear. Some people report hearing that gunshot. Others do not when the applause line is delivered. President Lincoln immediately slumps forward in his chair, losing consciousness. He'll not regain it again. It's Major Rathbone ultimately on the far end of the box that stands up and starts to confront John Wilkes Booth. He walks towards John Wilkes Booth. Booth drops the single-shot derringer to the floor of the box, and he pulls out a long Bowie knife and goes to stab at Major Rathbone. And he winds up striking him all the way down to the bone in the left arm, from the elbow down to the armpit. Major Rathbone staggers back in pain, and John Wilkes Booth swings over the balustrade to prepare to make an 11-foot leap onto the stage below. As he does so, one of his spurs is going to catch in the fabric of the Blue Treasury Guard flag, and so he lands awkwardly on the stage. But then Booth gets up, walks to center stage, holds aloft that bloody knife, looking out on the theater patrons, and he shouts out in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. In other words, he's calling out our 16th president as an evil ruler. He runs out the backstage door, mounts his running horse, and he rides quickly down Baptist Alley. He's going to turn right on F Street Northwest, and he's riding east across the district, eventually across the district line into Maryland, days later still into southern Maryland, and many, many days later still across the Potomac River and into northern Virginia. And it's there on the 12th day of his escape, inside a tobacco barn at the Garrett Farm, that he's housed. And he's refusing to give himself up as he's encircled by United States Army soldiers. I'll get to John Wilkes Booth in just a moment. As for President Lincoln, initially no one can get in through the barricaded door, but eventually the barricade is removed and people start to funnel into the box to see what the commotion is about. The first doctor in is Dr. Charles Leal, relatively fresh out of United States Army medical training. As he approaches the president, one of the first things he notices is the condition of the president's eyes. It looks very much like Civil War victims that have been hit by shrapnel or a bullet in the head. And as he gets closer, he quickly finds a wound behind the president's left ear. Unfortunately, Dr. Leal's assessment is that this is ultimately going to be fatal for the president. We think he's going to survive perhaps 2 or 3 hours at best. He's going to be joined by 2 other doctors. These 3 doctors are the consensus about President Lincoln. So with the assistance of many soldiers attending the play, some of them who come out to the box and lend their services, With the doctors trailing behind, the soldiers carry the president across the balcony, down the spiral staircase, and out onto 10th Street. They're banging on doors, calling out for any available bed nearby. No luck. When suddenly a door opens across the way at Peterson House. There's one boarder that opens the front door and steps out on the stoop. He sees the soldiers carrying the president, and he motions to them and says, "Bring him in here." They'll bring the president into a back bedroom down the hall. Now, with all these doctors and many more who come tending to the president around the clock, they sustain his life a lot longer than they had initially predicted. The president survives a little more than 9 hours, but early the next morning, Saturday, April 15, 1865, at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln breathes his last. As for John Wilkes Booth, 12 days later after making his escape, he's in a tobacco barn there at the Garrett Farm. He's refusing to give himself up. He's shouting ridiculous things out at the soldiers, telling them things like to back up a certain number of yards, fight each and every one of them to the death. The soldiers want no part of this, and they're growing increasingly exasperated with John Wilkes Booth. One of the soldiers decides to light the tobacco barn on fire to try and smoke John Wilkes Booth out of the barn. As those flames start to rise and lick the walls of the tobacco barn, some of the soldiers closer in, they're convinced they're catching glimpses of John Wilkes Booth between the gaps of the wooden slats of the tobacco barn. Some of the soldiers closer in are also convinced that John Wilkes Booth is raising up with a firearm to shoot him. So Boston Corbett of the New York Regiment Cavalry takes out a revolver, he fires a shot. That shot will hit John Wilkes Booth in the back, severing his spinal column, and he'll only live 2 more hours after that. Booth is dragged out of that barn and up onto a porch there at the Garrett Farm. He says a number of things before he dies, but his final words are quite simple. While looking at his hands, he says simply, "Useless, useless." And why would he say this? More likely than not, in plotting his course of revenge, John Wilkes Booth thought there might be others like himself. People that did not want blacks to have voting rights, people that supported the Confederacy during the Civil War, people that saw Abraham Lincoln as a commander-in-chief who was exceeding his constitutional authority as a wartime leader. And he thought individuals like this might hail him as a hero. But he's disavowed of this notion, because during that 12-day escape, he's given a Richmond, Virginia newspaper that had long been sympathetic to the Confederacy, and in very detailed coverage of the assassination and Booth's escape. Again and again, Booth is called out as a coward, not a hero as he envisioned. So Booth has tarnished his own name, the name of his famous acting family, but here's the far more difficult thing to think about in terms of what Booth actually did. I told you at the beginning of my talk that most professional historians, U.S. presidential historians, they caution that it takes a great deal of time before we can adequately evaluate most of our presidents. We have 2 prominent examples of this in the 20th century. One president, a member of the Democratic Party. The other president, a member of the Republican Party. These 2 individuals, after they left office, 5, 10, 15 years out, many prominent U.S. presidential historians and even some political scientists rank these 2 individuals in the bottom quarter of our presidents. They were seen as failures at the time. Look at those 2 names today, many, many decades removed from their respective presidencies, and invariably, you'll find those 2 names often listed in the top quarter of our U.S. presidents. They're seen as great successes today. And I'm speaking specifically here of Harry S. Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. There's no lengthy time such as this for Abraham Lincoln. Because of this very rash act at the tail end of the Civil War by John Wilkes Booth in this very theater, it actually speeds up that timetable for us to better assess and appreciate President Abraham Lincoln. I thank you for joining me here today. I'll stay after a few questions.